I fell in love with my married boss long before I admitted it to myself. Long before I said his name out loud in the dark and felt my chest tighten in response. Long before I understood that what I was carrying had weight and consequence, and a cost I was not prepared to calculate. By the time I finally called it love, it had already lived inside me for months, rearranging the way I moved through my days. And the worst part is this: nothing ever happened. No affair. No secret hotel rooms. No hands brushing accidentally and staying too long. Just attention. Just presence. Just the quiet, devastating intimacy of being seen by the wrong person at the wrong time in my life. His name was James Carter, and he was married. The kind of married that doesn't leave room for confusion. A wedding band worn without thought. Photographs on his desk. Stories that included his wife, Helen. The way punctuation includes commas. I noticed those things immediately. I registered them. I told myself they were boundaries, that knowing them would keep me safe. I believed that for a long time. The moment everything cracked open came late one evening, sitting alone in my car outside my flat in Canary Wharf. The engine was off. The radio had gone silent on its own. The street below was ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of place no one remembers once they leave it. I didn't get out of the car. I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, my body still holding the posture of the day. I remember noticing how quiet everything felt once the engine stopped. Too quiet. I stared at my reflection in the windscreen. The glass softened my face, blurred the edges, made me look like someone I only half recognized. I looked tired, not end-of-day tired, a deeper kind, the kind that comes from constantly adjusting yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. Then my phone vibrated, once, short, controlled. His name lit up the screen. James. And before my thoughts could catch up, before reason could intervene, my chest tightened. My breath shortened. My body leaned forward instinctively, like it had been waiting. That was the moment grief arrived. Not excitement, not thrill, grief, because I understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that something inside me had crossed a line my mouth had never spoken aloud. Something had moved without asking me. And once something moves inside you quietly and deliberately like that, it does not ask permission before it rearranges everything. I didn't open the message. I watched the screen dim, watched it go dark. Then I finally got out of the car and went upstairs, carrying that awareness with me like something fragile I didn't know how to put down. James Carter was my boss. Not in an abstract way, directly. He approved my work, led my team, signed off on decisions that shaped my days. Our office was in Southwark, all glass and steel and carefully managed silence. From the outside, everything about my life looked stable. I had a good job, a decent flat, a routine that worked. But stability is not the same as fullness. And I had been empty for longer than I realized. My mornings followed the same pattern. Wake before the alarm, shower too quickly, drink coffee standing up, scrolling through my phone without reading, commute half awake, watching my reflection slide past strangers in the train windows. At work, I was competent, reliable, the kind of employee people depended on without thinking too much about it. And James noticed that, not loudly, not in ways that drew attention, in small things. He remembered details I hadn't thought mattered, asked how something felt instead of just whether it was finished, paused before responding, like he was actually considering my words. It felt like being seen in a room where I had learned to make myself invisible. The first time I noticed the shift, I told myself it was nothing. Professional respect, good leadership, the kind of boss people say you should want. I clung to that explanation because the alternative felt dangerous. Because I was not lonely in an obvious way. Because I was not unhappy enough to justify wanting more. And because James was married, I told myself that over and over. Married, unavailable, safe. But safety is an illusion when emotional doors are left open. It didn't feel like love at first. It felt like relief. Relief that someone noticed when I stayed late. Relief that someone heard the hesitation in my voice and didn't rush to fill it. Relief that I didn't have to shrink to be acceptable. And relief is addictive when you've been carrying yourself alone for too long. I remember the first morning I woke up thinking about whether James would be in early. That's when the fear crept in. Because people don't accidentally rearrange their anticipation around someone else's presence. They don't accidentally feel disappointment at the absence of someone who is just a boss. Standing on the Jubilee Line platform, coat pulled tight around me, watching the digital sign flicker between delays, I felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest. This is not nothing. This is not harmless. And I don't know how to stop it. That was the season one was in. Not love. Not yet. But the slow erosion of distance. The soft closing of space I had always believed would protect me. And I had no idea how far it would go. There is a particular moment when awareness stops being protection and starts becoming weight. I didn't notice it immediately. At first, knowing felt like control. I told myself that because I could name what was happening, I could manage it, that I could keep it contained, that I was still the one deciding how far this went. But control is fragile when it's built on silence. The days after that night in Canary Wharf settled into something deceptively ordinary. Morning still began before the alarm. The kettle still clicked off too early. The train still carried me through tunnels filled with strangers, who all looked half awake, half somewhere else. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, everything had shifted just enough to make the familiar feel unstable. I started noticing time differently. How long it took for James to arrive in the mornings. The particular cadence of his footsteps when he walked down the corridor. The way my shoulders tensed slightly when I heard his voice before I saw him. I hated that awareness. I hated how automatic it felt. I told myself I was imagining it. That everyone notices patterns at work. That I was reading meaning into neutral things. But bodies are honest in ways minds are not. And my body had already begun to respond. At work, I was careful, almost deliberately restrained. I kept my emails short, professional. I didn't linger by his office. I didn't seek him out. I answered questions, gave updates, did my job. I thought distance would cool whatever this was. Instead, it gave it more room to echo. There is an ache that comes from wanting someone quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't push you toward action. It just hums beneath everything. Constant and low, like a machine you eventually stop noticing because it never turns off. I remember a Wednesday afternoon that felt unremarkable at the time. Gray light filtered through the glass walls. A meeting had run longer than planned. My stomach was empty because I'd forgotten to eat. James asked me to stay back after everyone else left. Not urgently, casually. The way people do when they assume you'll say yes. Chairs scraped softly as the room emptied. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, posture careful, aware of my own breathing. He talked about the project, asked my opinion. Then he waited, actually waited. As I spoke, he watched me with that same attentive stillness. Not nodding automatically, not interrupting, just present. When I finished, there was a pause, a small one, but enough for me to notice the way my chest rose and fell. He smiled and said, "You're very thoughtful about these things." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't praise designed to charm. It was acknowledgement. and my body responded before my mind could correct it. A warmth spread through my chest. My shoulders relaxed. Something inside me softened in a way that felt both comforting and dangerous. I left the room with my face carefully composed, my heart beating slightly faster than usual. I went straight to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall. Not because I needed it, because I needed to be alone. I sat there listening to the muted sounds of the office outside, the low hum of voices, the distant clatter of keyboards. This is not good, I told myself. This is how it starts. I washed my hands longer than necessary, stared at my reflection until my expression settled back into something neutral. Then I went back to my desk and finished my work. That became the pattern. Moment after moment that could be explained away. Individually harmless, collectively heavy. At home, evenings stretched in ways that felt longer than they should have. I cooked simple meals and ate them standing up at the counter. Sometimes I sat on the sofa with my laptop open, watching shows without really following the plot. Sometimes I lay on my bed fully dressed, scrolling through my phone without reading anything at all. I noticed how often my thoughts drifted toward James in these quiet spaces. Not fantasies, not imagined scenes, just his presence, his attention. The way my name sounded when he said it. I felt embarrassed by that wanting, ashamed of how quickly it had threaded itself into my routines. I told myself this was loneliness, not love, that if my life were fuller, this would dissolve on its own. So I tried to fill it. I met friends for drinks I didn't really enjoy, laughed at jokes I wasn't listening to, nodded through conversations that felt distant, like I was watching myself participate from somewhere else. I signed up for a gym membership I barely used. Said yes to invitations out of obligation rather than desire. But even surrounded by people, I felt oddly detached, as if part of me was somewhere else entirely. Sleep became restless. I would fall asleep easily, exhausted, then wake in the early hours with my mind already racing. Sometimes I dreamed of work, corridors, meetings, conversations that never quite finished. Sometimes I dreamed of nothing at all and woke with my jaw clenched and my hands curled into fists. Mornings felt heavier, not because of anything specific, because I was carrying something unnamed. At work, I noticed subtle changes in myself. How I adjusted my posture when James was nearby. How carefully I chose my words. How I avoided eye contact and then sought it without meaning to. This didn't feel like the crushes I remembered from my 20s. Those had been loud. This was quiet, contained, and that made it harder to dislodge. I reminded myself constantly that he was married. The ring, the photos, the casual way he mentioned Helen in conversation. Those should have been enough to stop me. Instead, they added a layer of guilt that sat alongside the longing, not in place of it. There is something uniquely painful about wanting someone who belongs clearly to someone else. Not secretly, not ambiguously, clearly. It removes the illusion of possibility while leaving the feeling intact. It means you are wanting something you know you should not want. And that knowledge does not make the wanting disappear. It just makes it lonelier. I remember a Friday evening toward the end of the month. Most people had left early. The office was quieter than usual. I was packing up my things when James walked past and asked if I was heading out. I said yes. He nodded and said, "Have a good weekend." That was it. No lingering, no invitation. Just a normal goodbye. And yet, as I walked toward the lift, I felt an unexpected sting. As if something had ended. As if I had been dismissed from a space I wasn't even sure I occupied. I went home that night and paced between rooms. I cooked and didn't eat. Turned the television on and off. sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the floor. I kept thinking, this is ridiculous. Nothing is happening. Why does it feel like this? Because feelings don't require permission. They don't need events to justify them. They grow in the dark. I promised myself I would put boundaries in place, that I would stop indulging the thoughts, that I would redirect my attention. I told myself I would treat James like any other boss, professional, neutral. I believed that promise until Monday morning, until I walked into the office and saw him standing near my desk, already waiting to speak to me. He smiled when he saw me, said good morning, asked how my weekend had been, and in that moment, every resolution I had made over the weekend dissolved quietly. Not dramatically, just gone, like fog burned away by light. I answered him. We spoke briefly, about nothing important. Then he walked away, and I stood there, feeling the familiar warmth settle back into my chest. That was the season I was in then, the season of restraint, of knowing better and feeling anyway, of telling myself I was still in control, while something inside me slowly rearranged its priorities. Nothing had happened, and yet everything felt different. That is the danger of emotional attachment. It does not announce itself with action. It announces itself with absence, with the space it quietly takes up inside you. And I was beginning to realize how much room it had already claimed. There came a point when the guilt stopped feeling sharp and started feeling dull. That frightened me more than anything else. At first, guilt had been loud. It flared whenever I caught myself thinking of James for too long. Whenever I felt that quiet lift in my chest when he walked into a room. Whenever I replayed conversations in my head on the train home. Guilt was what told me this mattered. But over time, it softened. Not because what I was feeling became acceptable, but because I learned how to live with it. And living with it changed me in ways I didn't notice until much later. The weeks folded into each other. Autumn crept in without ceremony. Mornings grew darker. Evenings arrived earlier. The office lights stayed on longer, casting everything in a tired yellow glow. My days followed a rhythm I could have recited from memory. Wake before the alarm, dress without thinking, commute half awake, work, come home, repeat. James was part of that rhythm now, not as a disruption, as a constant. I knew his schedule better than I realized. Which mornings he arrived early, which afternoons he disappeared into meetings, which days he worked from home and left the office feeling quieter. I hated that awareness, and yet I relied on it. It gave my days a shape. At work, our interactions remained contained, almost restrained to the point of stiffness. If anyone else noticed, they didn't say anything. If James noticed, he didn't acknowledge it. But there were moments, small ones, moments where the distance between us felt deliberate, almost careful, as if we were both holding something fragile and pretending it didn't exist. There was a Thursday afternoon when the office was unusually busy. Deadlines overlapping, phones ringing, everyone moving with a kind of anxious efficiency. James stopped by my desk with a question. Something minor, I answered, eyes on my screen. He thanked me and lingered a moment longer than necessary. I could feel his presence beside me. Not touching, not close enough to justify the awareness, but close enough that my breathing changed. He said, quietly, "Make sure you take a break today." I nodded. He walked away, and I sat there for several seconds, hands frozen on the keyboard, heart beating just a little too fast. That was all it took. Concern, attention, the kind that feels personal even when it isn't meant to be. At lunch, I ate alone at my desk. Again, I wasn't avoiding anyone. I just didn't feel like explaining myself. Didn't feel like performing normalcy when everything inside me felt slightly misaligned. I watched people move past my desk, heard laughter drift down the corridor, felt strangely separate from it all, like I was behind glass. In the afternoons, fatigue settled into my body in ways coffee couldn't fix. My shoulders stayed tight. My jaw ached from clenching. I caught myself holding my breath without realizing it. At home, the silence grew heavier. Evenings stretched in long, unbroken hours. I cooked out of habit, ate without appetite, left dishes in the sink longer than I used to. The flat felt smaller, not physically, emotionally, like the walls were quietly closing in. Some nights, I stood at the window and watched the lights across the river flicker on and off. I imagined other lives unfolding in those lit rooms. Conversations, shared dinners, arguments, laughter. I wondered what James and Helen were doing at that exact moment. Whether they were eating together, whether she noticed the way he went quiet sometimes, whether she felt close to him in ways I wasn't allowed to imagine. I hated myself for those thoughts, but I didn't stop having them. That's the thing about longing. It doesn't respond to shame. It just goes underground and grows roots. There was a morning when James didn't come into the office until late. I noticed immediately. My body registered his absence before my mind formed a thought. I kept glancing toward his office, caught myself listening for his footsteps. When he finally arrived, hours later, relief washed through me so quickly it almost made me dizzy. I hated that feeling, hated how automatic it had become. This is not love, I told myself. This is dependency. This is projection. This is loneliness looking for somewhere to land. I said those words often, on the train, in the shower, lying awake at night. They never stuck, because even if this wasn't love, it felt like something that mattered, and that was enough to keep it alive. James never crossed a line. That made it harder. There was no moment I could use as justification. No inappropriate comment. No lingering touch. No invitation that went too far. If anything, he was careful, respectful, professional to the point of restraint. Sometimes I wondered if he sensed it, if he felt the shift in the air the way I did, if he carried his own version of this quietly. But wondering about that only made things worse. Speculation is a dangerous companion. So I focused on what I could control. My behavior, my distance. I avoided being alone with him when I could. Kept conversations brief, neutral. I thought that was enough. Until it wasn't. The first crack came on an ordinary afternoon. One of those days that would have disappeared into memory if not for how it changed me. We were both staying late. Most of the office had cleared out. The sky outside the windows had darkened into that deep blue that comes before night fully settles. I was packing up when James stopped by my desk. He asked how I was holding up. The question landed heavier than it should have. I said I was fine. He looked at me for a moment longer, not scrutinizing, just looking. Then he said, "You don't always have to be fine, you know." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement, a simple one. But something inside me cracked open, because I realized how long it had been since anyone had said that to me. Not as a platitude, as recognition. I nodded, swallowed, sighed, "Thank you." He smiled gently and walked away. And I stood there, suddenly aware of how tired I was. Not just from work, from holding everything in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. Not because of what he said, because of what it revealed. I wasn't just carrying feelings for James. I was carrying a version of myself that no one else seemed to see. And that realization scared me, because it meant this wasn't about him alone. It was about what was missing in my life, what had been missing for a long time. And missing things don't disappear just because you acknowledge them. They demand to be addressed. I didn't know how to do that yet. All I knew was that the space this was taking up inside me had grown. Quietly, relentlessly, and I was no longer sure I could keep pretending it wasn't there. There is a moment when carrying something quietly stops feeling noble and starts feeling dangerous. I didn't recognize that moment right away. At first, I told myself I was managing this well. That restraint was proof of character. That silence was the responsible choice. Nothing had happened. That became the sentence I leaned on whenever the weight pressed too hard. Nothing had happened. Nothing had crossed a line. Nothing had been said aloud. But something was happening inside me, and it was taking more energy than I realized. The exhaustion settled in slowly, not the kind sleep fixes, the kind that lives in your bones. I started waking up already tired, not physically, emotionally, as if my body had spent the night holding itself in place. My mornings became sharper, more efficient. I moved through them like someone late for something they couldn't name. Shower, coffee, keys, train. I stopped listening to music on the commute. Silence felt easier, less demanding. On the train, I watched my reflection slide past the dark tunnel windows. I noticed how often my jaw was clenched, how shallow my breathing had become. I had to remind myself to exhale. At work, I functioned. That was the word that fit best. I completed tasks, answered emails, attended meetings, but something in me had gone flat. Not numb, just muted, like I was constantly holding the volume down so nothing would spill. James noticed before I did. Not directly, not in a way I could confront. In the way he paused before speaking to me now. In the slight tilt of his head when I answered questions too quickly. In the careful neutrality of his tone. As if he was aware that something delicate was at play and didn't want to disturb it. That awareness made everything worse. Because it meant I wasn't alone in feeling the shift. But also that neither of us was willing to name it. There was a morning when we arrived at the office at the same time. Pure coincidence. The lift doors opened and there he was. Coffee in hand, code still on. He smiled and said good morning. I said it back. Our voices sounded normal. Everything about the interaction was appropriate. But standing there beside him, so close we could have brushed sleeves if either of us moved, I felt the tension humming between us like static. The lift ride was short, too short. When the doors opened, we stepped out separately. I walked back to my desk with my heart beating harder than it should have. I hated that my body reacted this way. Hated that proximity felt like something to survive rather than something neutral. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A meeting I barely followed. An email I had to reread 3 times. Lunch I forgot to eat until mid-afternoon. By the time evening came, my head ached. I went home and collapsed onto the sofa without even turning on the lights. I sat there in the dark, code still on, staring at nothing. That was when the thought surfaced, uninvited. I can't keep doing this. Not the situation, the silence. The pretending. I wasn't in love in a way that asked to be acted on, but I was invested in a way that was draining me. And there is a cost to caring quietly. It shows up in the body, in the way you flinch at messages, in the way you rehearse conversations that never happen, in the way you feel guilty even when you've done nothing wrong. I started noticing how much mental space James occupied. How often my thoughts circled back to him without intention. Whether he was stressed, whether he was tired, whether he noticed the way I pulled back. That kind of attention is intimate, whether you admit it or not. And intimacy that isn't acknowledged becomes heavy. The guilt returned then, sharper, less abstract. Not because of his marriage. That had always been there, but because I was beginning to understand what this was costing me. I was less present with friends, less engaged with my own life. I was postponing decisions, avoiding quiet moments where the truth might surface. One evening, I met my friend Lavra for dinner near London Bridge. We sat at a small table by the window. She talked about her job, her new flat, her plans. I nodded at the right moments, asked questions, smiled, but my attention drifted. I caught myself wondering if James had stayed late that night, if he was still at the office, if he'd gone home yet. Lavra paused mid-sentence and looked at me. "You're miles away," she said. I laughed it off, sighed I was tired. She didn't push, but the look she gave me lingered. Concerned, curious. I walked home afterward feeling hollow, because it wasn't just James who noticed my absence. Others did too. I was leaving pieces of myself scattered everywhere, and I didn't know how to gather them back. The realization came slowly, painfully. This wasn't sustainable. Not because it might turn into something more, but because it was already something. Something I was feeding quietly every day. Something that asked for emotional labor without offering resolution. Something that kept me suspended in between. And being suspended like that changes you. It makes you cautious, withdrawn, always slightly braced. I began to imagine what would happen if this continued. Not dramatically, not an affair, just years of this, carrying an unspoken attachment, measuring my days around someone else's presence, never crossing a line, but never fully free either. The thought exhausted me, and for the first time, I felt something close to anger, not at James, at myself, for allowing this to take root, for mistaking attention for connection, for not demanding more from my own life. That anger didn't motivate me into action. It didn't clarify anything, but it did change the tone of the guilt. It made it heavier, less romantic, more urgent. Something needed to shift. I didn't know what. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was harmless, because harmless things don't drain you like this. Harmless things don't follow you home. Harmless things don't wake you up at 3 in the morning with your chest tight and your thoughts racing. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling. I thought about the life I was living, the one that looked fine from the outside, the one that felt increasingly narrow from the inside. And I realized something quietly devastating. I wasn't just afraid of crossing a line. I was afraid of admitting how lonely I had been long before James ever noticed me. That fear sat heavy in my chest, because loneliness asks harder questions than attraction ever does. I didn't decide to change anything all at once. There was no moment of resolve, no promise I made to myself that felt solid enough to stand on. What happened instead was smaller, quieter. I began to pull away without announcing it. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice. Just in the way you start holding your breath around something you know is fragile. I answered emails a little later than usual. I kept my replies strictly about work. No extra sentences. No warmth I hadn't consciously chosen. When James stopped by my desk, I stood up instead of staying seated. Created a physical boundary that felt subtle but deliberate. He noticed. I could tell by the way his expression shifted slightly. Not confused, just attentive, as if he sensed a change in temperature and was adjusting accordingly. He didn't ask about it. That was his way. Respectful, contained, and that restraint, which once felt safe, now felt heavy. Because it meant nothing would be forced into the open. Nothing would be clarified. We would simply orbit each other at a slightly greater distance, pretending nothing had shifted. The days stretched. Work continued. Meetings, deadlines, small conversations that never lingered. From the outside, it probably looked like I was doing better, more focused, more composed. But internally, the silence grew louder. Pulling away did not make the feeling disappear. It just removed the small moments that had made it bearable. There is a strange grief in choosing distance from something that never belonged to you. You can't explain it to anyone. You can't justify it. You're grieving something you were never entitled to in the first place. That grief showed up in unexpected ways. In the way I felt the hollow dip in my chest when James wasn't around. In the way his absence now felt sharper because I had stopped allowing myself the small comforts of proximity. In the way my body still reacted even as my behavior became more controlled. One afternoon, James asked if we could talk. Just briefly. His tone was neutral, professional. My stomach tightened anyway. We went into one of the small meeting rooms. Glass walls, neutral chairs. A space designed for conversations that mattered just enough. He asked if everything was all right at work, with me. The question was careful, not invasive, not personal, but it landed deeper than he could have known. I said yes, too quickly, then corrected myself. Sighed, I was just tired. He nodded, accepted that answer. That silence was the responsible choice. Nothing had happened. That became the sentence I leaned on whenever the weight pressed too hard. Nothing had happened. Nothing had crossed a line. Nothing had been said aloud. But something was happening inside me, and it was taking more energy than I realized. The exhaustion settled in slowly, not the kind sleep fixes, the kind that lives in your bones. I started waking up already tired. Not physically, emotionally, as if my body had spent the night holding itself in place. My mornings became sharper, more efficient. I moved through them like someone late for something they couldn't name. Shower, coffee, keys, train. I stopped listening to music on the commute. Silence felt easier, less demanding. On the train, I watched my reflection slide past the dark tunnel windows. I noticed how often my jaw was clenched, how shallow my breathing had become. I had to remind myself to exhale. At work, I functioned. That was the word that fit best. I completed tasks, answered emails, attended meetings, but something in me had gone flat. Not numb, just muted, like I was constantly holding the volume down so nothing would spill. James noticed before I did. Not directly, not in a way I could confront. In the way he paused before speaking to me now. In the slight tilt of his head when I answered questions too quickly. In the careful neutrality of his tone. As if he was aware that something delicate was at play and didn't want to disturb it. That awareness made everything worse. Because it meant I wasn't alone in feeling the shift. But also that neither of us was willing to name it. There was a morning when we arrived at the office at the same time. Pure coincidence. The lift doors opened and there he was. Coffee in hand, code still on. He smiled and said good morning. I said it back. Our voices sounded normal. Everything about the interaction was appropriate. But standing there beside him, so close we could have brushed sleeves if either of us moved, I felt the tension humming between us like static. The lift ride was short, too short. When the doors opened, we stepped out separately. I walked back to my desk with my heart beating harder than it should have. I hated that my body reacted this way. Hated that proximity felt like something to survive rather than something neutral. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A meeting I barely followed. An email I had to reread 3 times. Lunch I forgot to eat until mid-afternoon. By the time evening came, my head ached. I went home and collapsed onto the sofa without even turning on the lights. I sat there in the dark, code still on, staring at nothing. That was when the thought surfaced, uninvited. I can't keep doing this. Not the situation, the silence. The pretending. I wasn't in love in a way that asked to be acted on, but I was invested in a way that was draining me. I was no longer imagining what could be. I was sitting with what was, and what was felt unfinished, not between us, within me. That's when I understood something quietly devastating. Falling in love with my married boss wasn't the story. It was the symptom. The story was how invisible I had allowed myself to become in my own life. And symptoms don't disappear until you treat the cause. I didn't know what healing would look like. I still don't. But I knew it wouldn't come from staying suspended between restraint and longing. It would come from choosing myself in ways I hadn't before. Slowly, awkwardly, without certainty. The last time James and I spoke that week, it was brief, professional, unremarkable. And when I walked away, my chest didn't ache the way it used to. It felt quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. Like the hum had finally lowered enough for me to hear myself think. That quiet scared me, but it also felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply waits for you to stop running from it. The quiet did not last. It never does. Silence has a way of creating space, and space has a way of filling itself with things you've been avoiding. At first, the quiet felt like relief. I could breathe again without checking myself. My thoughts stopped circling one name. My body stopped bracing for footsteps in the corridor. But beneath that relief was something heavier, a kind of reckoning that had nowhere else to go. Without the constant hum of wanting, I began to notice everything else. How empty my evenings felt. How automatic my routines had become. How little of myself I had been offering to my own life. I came home one evening and stood in the middle of my flat, coat still on, bag on the floor, lights off. I didn't move. I just stood there, listening to the quiet I had worked so hard to create. And I realized I didn't know what to do with it. The days continued. James remained present, but no longer central. We spoke when necessary. Exchanged polite, efficient words. He respected the distance without comment. If he felt anything about the shift, he never let it show. That restraint, which once had felt like intimacy, now felt like closure. Unspoken, incomplete, but real. And with that closure came grief. Not the dramatic kind, the slow kind. The kind that settles into your body and changes the way you move. I found myself tired in new ways, not emotionally overwhelmed, emotionally exposed. Without the distraction of longing, I was face to face with myself, with the choices I had made, with the ways I had learned to survive rather than live. I started taking longer walks after work, not to clear my head, just to delay going home. I walked along the river near Canary Wharf, watching the water reflect the city lights. I watched couples pass me, fingers intertwined, arguing quietly, laughing loudly, existing together in ways that felt both foreign and familiar. I wondered when I had stopped wanting that, or if I ever really had. At night, sleep came more easily, but dreams became heavier. I dreamed of rooms I couldn't leave, of conversations that ended just before something important was said, of standing in crowds where no one could hear me speak. I woke up with my chest tight, my hands clenched. Mornings felt fragile, not rushed, fragile, as if one wrong thought could crack something open. I began to understand that I had been using the attachment to James as a way to avoid making decisions about my own life. It had given me something to focus on, something to feel, something that felt meaningful without requiring action. And now that it was gone, I was left with the question I had been postponing. What now? I didn't know how to answer it. So I started small, painfully small. I cooked real meals instead of eating standing up. I sat at the table and ate them slowly. I turned the television off and let the silence stay. I called my mother one evening and actually listened to her voice instead of half listening while doing something else. I said no to invitations I didn't want and yes to ones that made me uncomfortable in the right way. None of it felt transformative. None of it felt like healing. It felt awkward, unimpressive, like learning how to walk differently after years of limping. At work, I noticed changes too. Not in James, in myself. I spoke more in meetings, not louder, more honestly. I stopped watching for his reaction when I shared an idea, stopped measuring myself against his attention. That shift was subtle, but it mattered. One afternoon, weeks later, James stopped by my desk, not to ask a question, just to say thank you for something I'd handled well. Our eyes met briefly. There was no tension, no pull, just recognition. And in that moment, I felt something loosen inside me. Not affection, respect. For both of us. For the line that had never been crossed. For the restraint that had cost something, but also protected something. I realized then that love does not always need to be acted on to be real. But it also does not need to be carried forever. Some feelings are meant to arrive, teach you something, and then leave. Not dramatically, quietly, the way this one had. I still think about James sometimes, not with longing, with clarity. I see now what he represented, not a future, a mirror. He showed me what it felt like to be seen. And instead of chasing that feeling again, I am learning to create it in my own life. Slowly, imperfectly, without guarantees. I don't know where this path leads. I don't know who I will become once I stop orienting myself around absence. But I do know this. Falling in love with my married boss was never about him. It was about the parts of me that had gone quiet. The parts that were waiting. The parts that wanted more and didn't know how to ask. I am listening to them now. Not all at once. Not bravely. Just honestly. And that honesty doesn't feel like resolution. It feels like beginning. If this story found its way into you, if it echoed something you haven't said out loud yet, you're not alone in that quiet. You don't have to have answers. You don't have to fix anything tonight. Sometimes, noticing is enough to start. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that sit with the uncomfortable truths we carry quietly, take a moment to subscribe. And if you feel able, share this with someone who might need to hear it in the dark. I'll be here, listening, when you're ready.